You never found your brother, did you? The words came just 20 minutes after the minibus had left Przemysl and begun its journey to Paris. Alexander slowly turned his head. An elderly woman was sitting beside him, a dark coat, an old handbag resting on her lap, gray hair tucked beneath a scarf. Nothing unusual. Passengers like her traveled this route all the time. Yet his heart suddenly slammed against his chest, because almost no one knew about his brother, and even fewer knew that the boy had vanished many years ago without a trace and had never been found. "Excuse me, what did you say?" "I asked if you ever found your brother." She said it calmly, as if she were talking about the weather, as if she hadn't just touched the most painful memory of his life. "Who are you?" The woman looked at him for a long moment. A person who stayed silent for far too long. Then she turned toward the window and said nothing more. At that moment, Alexander realized this trip would be unlike any other. Darkness was quickly swallowing the landscape outside. Heavy clouds hung over the highway. The lights of towns faded behind them, while a long road stretched ahead through the European night. There were 11 passengers in the minibus. A young couple scrolled through photos on a phone. A man in a sports jacket was already asleep against the window. 2 passengers in the back quietly discussed work. The driver focused on the road. Everything seemed perfectly ordinary. Everyone except Alexander. He could think of nothing else. He searched for an explanation. Maybe the woman knew someone in his family. Maybe she had heard the story years ago. Maybe it was some bizarre coincidence. But the more he thought about it, the less he believed in coincidence. She hadn't asked whether he had a brother. She hadn't asked what happened to him. She had gone straight to the truth. 2 hours later, rain began to fall. Drops tapped against the roof of the minibus. The headlights of oncoming cars blurred across the wet glass. The highway gradually emptied. Most passengers began drifting to sleep. Alexander tried to close his eyes. It was impossible. He constantly felt the woman's presence beside him, as if she were waiting for the right moment. And that moment came during their first major stop. It was almost 11 at night. The minibus pulled into a brightly lit service station. Dozens of trucks were parked nearby. Drivers drank coffee, some smoked beneath a shelter. The rain had eased. Alexander bought a hot coffee and stepped outside. He stood beside the vehicle when he heard the familiar voice. "You still blame yourself." The woman stood beside him. She had appeared so quietly that he hadn't noticed her approach. For what? Though he already knew the answer. For that day. Alexander remained silent. "You think that if you hadn't left him alone, none of this would have happened?" The coffee suddenly tasted bitter, because that was exactly what he had believed all these years. Exactly what kept him awake at night. And nobody knew it. Absolutely nobody. Who are you? You'll find out soon enough. After midnight, the road grew even darker. The rain returned. Fog spread across the highway. Inside the minibus, silence settled over everyone. Only the steady hum of the engine remained. Around 2 in the morning, the woman suddenly spoke again. "He didn't die that day." Alexander turned sharply. "What? Your brother? How do you know that?" "Because I saw him. That's impossible." 3 years after he disappeared. Alexander felt his throat go dry. He stared at her, unable to believe what he was hearing. "You're lying." "No." "Prove it." Without a word, she opened her bag. She pulled out an old envelope and handed it to him. Inside was a photograph, old and slightly faded. A boy around 12 years old looked back from the image. The ground seemed to vanish beneath Alexander's feet. He recognized the face instantly. It was Andrei, his brother, a few years older than he had been on the day he disappeared. On the back of the photograph was a date. 3 years after that terrible day. Alexander barely slept until dawn. Night highways rolled past outside the windows. The fog thickened and thinned in waves. Sometimes long convoys of trucks overtook the minibus. Sometimes the road seemed completely empty. When daylight finally began to appear, the woman spoke again. She explained that many years earlier, she had worked at a small shelter. One day, a frightened boy had been brought there. His name, he said, was Andrei. He remembered almost nothing. Not his address, not his surname, only his first name. At first, everyone believed he had suffered severe trauma. Months passed, then years. Some of his memory returned, but he refused to talk about his past, as though he feared something. Then something strange happened. Several years later, he disappeared from the shelter, without explanation, without a trace, for the second time. "And that's the whole story?" Alexander asked. "No. The woman stared out the window for a long moment. The most important part is what I never told anyone. His heart began racing again. What do you mean? Years later, he found me. Alexander froze. What? He was already an adult. One day he simply appeared. He said he remembered me. He remembered the shelter. He remembered his life. And you stayed silent? Let me finish, she sighed heavily. He asked me not to look for his family. He asked me not to tell anyone. He said he wasn't ready to return. That's impossible. I thought so too. Alexander stared at her, unsure what to feel. Anger, shock, confusion, decades of searching, decades without answers. And all that time his brother had been alive. Why? Because he blamed himself. For what? For everything that happened after he disappeared. The woman's voice softened. He believed he had ruined everyone's lives. That's why he never found the courage to come back. Alexander clenched his fists. The story sounded so painful and so senseless that it was hard to accept. The minibus was approaching Paris. Traffic grew heavier. More and more vehicles filled the roads. Passengers began waking up. Some checked their phones. Others stared out the windows. But for Alexander, the entire world had narrowed to a single question. Where is he now? The woman was silent for a long time. Then she answered, "That's why I'm on this trip." Her voice trembled for the first time. What does that mean? She opened her bag once more. This time, she removed another envelope, a newer one, carefully sealed. Only one name was written on it, Alexander. He left this for you. Where is he? The woman closed her eyes. He passed away a few months ago. The world stopped. The engine noise, the voices of the passengers, the movement outside, everything vanished. Only those words remained, words that had arrived decades too late. When the minibus finally stopped in Paris, passengers gathered their belongings. Some hurried off to work, others called relatives. For everyone else, it was the end of an ordinary trip. For Alexander, it was something entirely different. He stood on the sidewalk holding the letter. The woman was preparing to leave. Why now? She smiled sadly. Because I promised him. What? To deliver it in person. Then she turned away and disappeared into the crowd. He never saw her again. Alexander didn't open the envelope for another hour. Inside were several sheets of paper and a photograph, a recent one. A man was smiling at the camera, his brother, grown up. The letter contained only a few lines. If you're reading this, it means I never found the courage to meet you face to face. Forgive me. All these years I wanted to come back, hundreds of times. But the longer I waited, the harder it became to take that first step. I don't know if I deserve forgiveness, but there's one thing I need you to know. You were never responsible for what happened. Never. Alexander read those words again and again, over and over. And for the first time in nearly 30 years, he felt the weight he had carried inside finally begin to lift. You can lose someone twice. The first time is when they disappear. The second time is when you realize you'll never get the chance to say the words that matter most. Standing in the middle of a busy Paris morning, Alexander looked at his brother's photograph and thought about only one thing. Sometimes the truth arrives far too late, but even then, it can still change an entire life. vidIQ.